We had already lost. The war against the Zalzir had raged for over 20 years, and we had nothing left to fight with. Our fleets were shattered, our soldiers exhausted, and our once thriving core worlds reduced to barren wastelands. Each battle had been another nail in our coffin, another desperate stand that only delayed the inevitable. I stood on the bridge of the Excalibur, one of the last great battleships of the Galactic Union's once mighty navy. The holo displays flickered with casualty reports, fleet movements, and intercepted Zalzir transmissions. None of it mattered anymore. The enemy's numbers were overwhelming, their technology vastly superior, and their strategy unrelenting. The final message had just come in from High Command. The war was over. I clenched my fists as I read the official transmission. The Union was preparing for a full surrender. Negotiations would begin within the next solar cycle, and every surviving fleet was ordered to stand down. Surrender? The very thought of it made bile rise in my throat. I turned away from the display, looking at my bridge crew, officers and soldiers who had fought and bled beside me, beings from a dozen different species, all standing in rigid silence. Their faces were blank, but I could see it in their eyes. The same helpless rage burned in them as it did in me. Lieutenant Vorka, a reptilian officer from the Drathian clans, broke the silence. His voice was low, guttural. "So this is how it ends." No one answered. It was Admiral Krell who finally spoke. The elder Draxian officer had been leading fleets since before I was born, and his deep, measured voice had always carried the weight of experience. Now, it carried only defeat. "We fought with honor," he said, as if that made any difference. The Zalzir were too strong. Honor? I nearly laughed. What had honor brought us? Burned cities, dead civilians, a war we had no hope of winning. And now some of those people had died, which hit hard. That made me realize just how much we had suffered. Before I could voice my frustration, the doors to the bridge slid open. A delegation entered, walking with the sharp, purposeful stride of those who had no patience for ceremony. Humans. Their leader, General Elias Blackwell, was a tall, lean figure clad in dark military armor. His presence alone carried a weight that made the air feel heavier. His cold, steel-gray eyes swept across the room, taking in each of us in a single glance. "You're surrendering," he said, his voice like a blade. "That's a mistake." Admiral Krell stepped forward, his brow furrowing. "We don't have a choice. We've lost." Blackwell tilted his head slightly, as if considering the words. Then he shook his head. "No. You've lost. We haven't even started fighting yet." The room went silent. I stared at him, trying to understand what he meant. The humans had fought alongside us, but their numbers were small. They lacked the fleets, the infrastructure. How could they possibly win? Blackwell took another step forward, his voice unwavering. "The problem is, you've been fighting a war of soldiers and honor. But wars aren't won by honor. They're won by ruthlessness." Still, a chill ran through me as he continued. "Give us command," Blackwell said. "Let us show you how humanity fights." The silence in the command chamber was suffocating. General Blackwell's words hung in the air like a challenge, his steel-gray eyes sweeping over the Union's highest-ranking officers. I could see the unease on their faces, the hesitation. The humans had always been an anomaly, unpredictable, reckless, violent. We had invited them into the Union's war effort out of desperation, but we had never truly trusted them. And now they were demanding control. Admiral Krell folded his arms, his reptilian brow furrowing in disapproval. "You propose that we hand over supreme command to your people? Based on what? Your arrogance?" Blackwell didn't flinch. He merely clasped his hands behind his back and spoke in that same cold, measured tone. Based on the fact that the way you've been fighting is a guaranteed path to extinction. Krell bristled, but Blackwell didn't let him respond. He gestured toward the holographic display in the center of the room, where the latest battle reports were projected in grim red markers. The Jaozor are winning because they don't fear you, he continued. They know exactly how the Union fights. Orderly, predictable, restrained. They know you'll protect civilian populations. They know you'll withdraw when the battle turns against you. They know you'll seek negotiations instead of escalation. You've made this war comfortable for them. I felt a cold chill creep down my spine. Humans don't fight like that, Blackwell said. We don't give our enemies time to regroup. We don't give them a moment's peace. We make them afraid. And fear, he leaned forward, placing his hands on the table, is the greatest weapon in war. The room was still. No one dared to speak. It was Chancellor Oriya, a Zalithian diplomat, who finally broke the silence. You speak of fear, she said, her luminous violet eyes narrowing. But war is not only about tactics. There are ethics. There are limits. The Union is dead if you don't act now, Blackwell cut her off. The Zalzir don't care about your ethics. They don't recognize your limits. The moment they break your fleets, they will burn your worlds, every single one of them, and they won't hesitate. He straightened, his voice becoming even colder. Neither will we. The brutality of his words sent a wave of unease through the room. Admiral Krell exhaled sharply. What exactly are you proposing? Blackwell didn't hesitate. Total war. No more defensive battles, no more holding the line. We take the fight to them. We burn their supply lines. We destroy their infrastructure. We turn every occupied planet into a death trap. We do to them what they've done to us. Only worse. I saw it then, the flicker of doubt, the fear in the faces of my fellow officers. We had been fighting for survival, but what Blackwell was suggesting? It wasn't just survival. It was annihilation. And if we refuse? Oriya asked quietly. Blackwell tilted his head. Then you surrender, he said, and you watch your homeworlds burn. The choice was clear. The shift in strategy was immediate and absolute. Where once the Union's fleets had fought with caution, executing strategic retreats and preserving infrastructure, the humans introduced something far more terrifying: total warfare. They did not see battlefields. They saw opportunities for extermination. Every skirmish became a slaughter, every battle a lesson in brutality. The first major engagement under human command was at the Orvik system, where a Zalzir occupation fleet was using the planet's orbital stations as a forward operating base. The Union's previous attempts to retake Orvik had failed. Each time, we lost more ships, more soldiers. The planet's remaining civilian population had been suffering under Zalzir rule for years. General Blackwell didn't hesitate. He didn't order a conventional assault, nor did he propose a siege. Instead, he issued a single command: burn the sky. Human warships targeted the planet's atmosphere with a coordinated kinetic bombardment. Massive tungsten rods, fired from orbital platforms, shattered the Zalzir fortifications on the surface. But that wasn't the true horror. The humans ignited the debris field. A chain reaction of controlled explosions filled the upper atmosphere with billions of burning fragments, turning the very air into a storm of fire and molten metal. The Zalzir forces on the ground had nowhere to run. Their supply lines were cut, their reinforcements unable to land. They suffocated, burned, and died screaming. Not a single Exaldir survived. I watched from the bridge of the Excalibur as the planet below was enveloped in the glowing embers of orbital destruction. The humans had not merely won the battle, they had erased the enemy from existence. They figured they didn't have to play ball anymore, so they tried something different. For the first time, the Zalzir hesitated. It wasn't just Orvac. The same doctrine was applied across the warfront. The Zalzir homeworlds, once considered untouchable, suddenly became targets. Human special forces infiltrated deep behind enemy lines, sabotaging critical supply chains, assassinating key warlords, poisoning entire food supplies. The Zalzir had expected an honorable fight. Instead, they found themselves hunted, their leaders dragged from their fortresses and executed on live broadcasts for all their empire to see. Terror spread through their ranks like wildfire. And that was when the humans did something even I couldn't have predicted. They stopped taking prisoners. Union policy had always dictated that captured Zalzir soldiers were held in POW camps, interrogated, then released in prisoner exchanges. Humans had no interest in such practices. Captured Zalzir simply disappeared. Some whispered that they were ejected into the void, others that they were subjected to horrific experimentation. No one knew for sure. But the effect was undeniable. For the first time in history, the Zalzir fleet broke formation in the middle of battle, not to regroup, but to flee. Their warlords, once so confident in their conquest, now feared for their own lives. The unstoppable tide of their empire had been met with something they had never encountered before. The empire had been grabbed and swept away by the forces of demonism, pure, unrelenting human ruthlessness. The Zalzir were breaking. For decades, they had been the galaxy's apex predators, their war machine an unstoppable tide that swallowed entire civilizations. They had expanded without resistance, their conquests swift and merciless. Every species they encountered either submitted or perished. The Galactic Union had been just another stepping stone in their grand campaign, until the humans took control. Now, for the first time in their history, the Zalzir were running. I witnessed it myself at the Battle of Theron Prime. It was meant to be a decisive victory for the Zalzir. Their fleet outnumbered ours 3-1, their warships technologically superior, their ground forces already entrenched on the planet's surface. In any logical scenario, we should have been crushed. But humans don't fight logical wars. When the battle began, the Zalzir expected a traditional engagement. They had studied Union tactics for years, knew how we moved, how we defended, how we retreated. They thought they understood the rules of war. Then the humans rewrote them. Instead of a conventional fleet engagement, Blackwell's forces executed a planetary siege unlike anything the Zalzir had ever encountered. Human warships didn't just engage, they hunted. They cut off escape routes, jammed communications, disabled life support systems. They turned the battlefield into a slaughterhouse. But the worst part was what happened on the ground. Human shock troops landed in the middle of Zalzir strongholds, not with the goal of capturing them, but of eradicating every living enemy. They deployed weapons we had never sanctioned, chemical agents that melted flesh from bone, nanite swarms that turned bodies into dust, incendiary weapons that burned hotter than any flame. They didn't take prisoners. They didn't offer surrender. The Zalzir, once fearless warriors, began throwing down their weapons, begging for mercy. There was none. I remember watching the battle from the bridge, listening to the desperate screams over intercepted transmissions. The Zalzir warlords issued frantic orders, demanding their troops hold their ground. But their forces weren't just losing, they were being wiped out. By the end of the battle, an entire Zalzir armada had been obliterated. 3 million ground troops had been exterminated. Not a single enemy soldier escaped. The name Theron Prime would forever be a warning, a symbol of what happened to those who fought against humanity. And it didn't stop there. Across the warfront, more and more Zalzir forces abandoned their posts. Entire fleets deserting before the humans could reach them. Warlords once eager for conquest now barricaded themselves inside their fortresses, terrified of what awaited them. Fear had shattered the Zalzir. But I knew Blackwell wasn't done. The Zalzir weren't just losing the war. They were about to be erased from existence. At first, we rejoiced. The Exalzir had been our nightmare for decades, an unstoppable force that had torn through our fleets and ravaged our worlds. But now, they were running. The unbreakable conquerors of the galaxy were reduced to desperate refugees, their fleets shattered, their soldiers surrendering before a single shot was fired. The war was turning in our favor, and for the first time in years, victory felt inevitable. Then the reports started coming in. At first, they were just whispers, unconfirmed stories from the front lines. Entire Zalzir colonies vanishing overnight. Cities that should have been occupied instead found scorched, every living thing wiped from existence. Prisoners that were supposed to be transferred to holding facilities simply disappearing. The official reports from Human Command were vague. Tactical purges, they called them, eliminations of high-risk targets. But the truth was something far worse. The humans weren't just fighting the Zalzir. They were exterminating them. I saw it firsthand at Trelos 4. The planet had been a Zalzir military hub, heavily fortified and defended by an entire legion of their elite warriors. Under normal Union doctrine, we would have surrounded the planet, cut off its supply lines, and forced a surrender. Humans didn't waste time with that. Blackwell gave the order without hesitation. Deploy the Omega Protocol. I didn't know what it was at first. No one outside Human Command did. We assumed it was a new form of orbital bombardment, some kind of high-yield planetary strike. But when the human fleet launched their payload, it wasn't explosives that rained down, but it was something far worse. Trelos 4's atmosphere turned black within hours. The Zalzir forces on the ground collapsed, their bodies dissolving from the inside out. The civilians, women, children, non-combatants, suffered the same fate. The entire ecosystem of the planet was consumed by a silent, creeping horror. By the time the process was complete, Trelos 4 was a dead world. Not a single Zalzir life form remained. When I confronted Blackwell, demanding to know what had been unleashed, he only stared at me with those cold, unreadable eyes. "The war ends when they're gone," he said. Completely. I felt the sickness settle in my gut. The war had always been about survival, about stopping the Zalzir from eradicating us, but now we were the ones committing genocide. I looked at my fellow officers, at the non-human commanders of the Union, and I could see it in their faces. They were starting to realize the same thing. We had created something far worse than the Zalzir, and we had given it control. I knew then that even if we won this war, we would never be the same, because humanity wasn't just defeating our enemy. They were teaching us what true ruthlessness meant. The war was no longer a war, it was annihilation. With every battle, the Zalzir lost more than just soldiers. They lost entire bloodlines, whole civilizations erased in the span of hours. Their empire, once the great predator of the galaxy, was now nothing more than prey, running from an enemy that refused to stop hunting them. The humans had become something else, something terrifying. We should have been celebrating. Every planet liberated was another victory, another step toward reclaiming what we had lost. But instead, there was only silence and unspoken horror spreading through the ranks of the Galactic Union's officers and soldiers. Because deep down, we all knew the truth. We had created a monster. I had thought I understood humanity. I had fought beside them, watched them bleed, watched them sacrifice everything to survive. I had admired their resilience, their brilliance in battle. But I had never seen them truly unleashed. Not until now. Entire Zalzir colonies were wiped out before they even knew they were under attack. Human warships didn't engage in prolonged battles anymore. They executed precision strikes, deploying weapons designed to kill every biological entity on a planet while leaving the infrastructure intact. No survivors, no resistance, just empty worlds waiting to be repopulated. And it wasn't just their weapons, it was their tactics. They sent captured Zalzir officers back to their own people, infected with biological plagues that spread like wildfire. They turned Zalzir communications against them, broadcasting the executions of their leaders in gruesome detail, forcing every soldier, every civilian, to watch as their warlords begged for mercy that would never come. The Zalzir didn't just lose battles. They lost hope. Remember the moment I realized there would be no negotiations, no surrender. It was on the bridge of the Excalibur during a high-level war council. We had received a transmission from a Zalzir faction, a desperate group of survivors offering unconditional surrender. They were willing to lay down their arms, to give us access to all their remaining military assets. All they asked was to be spared. The Union commanders hesitated. Blackwell didn't. "Decline the transmission," he ordered. Admiral Krell, his scales pale with unease, turned toward him. "They're surrendering. The war is over." Blackwell's expression didn't change. "Not until there's no one left to fight it." A cold silence settled over the room. The Union had never fought a war like this before. Even against the Zalzir, we had always believed in a line, a point where enough was enough. But for humans, there was no line. There was only victory and the total destruction of their enemy. I knew then that even if the war ended, the galaxy would never forget what had happened. And it would never forgive humanity for what it had become. Or at least, it should have been. The Zalzir no longer had an empire. Their fleets were gone, their colonies burned, their homeworlds lifeless husks. What few survivors remained were scattered, hunted down by human strike teams that moved through the void like wraiths. We had won. But victory did not feel like salvation. It felt like something else, something darker. The Galactic Union had been founded on principles of unity, diplomacy, and survival. For centuries, we had believed that war was a necessary evil, but one that should always be fought with restraint. Even against the Zalzir, we had held to that belief, refusing to become the monsters we feared. The humans had no such illusions. I stood in the war room of the Excalibur, watching as the final battle reports came in. There was no celebration, no speeches of triumph, just cold efficiency, another mission complete. The Zalzir were gone, erased. General Blackwell stood at the center of it all, arms folded behind his back, his expression unreadable. "You've done it," I said, my voice hollow. "The war is over." He turned to me, his gaze sharp. It was over the moment we took command. I wanted to argue, to tell him that this was more than victory. It was extermination, but I already knew what his answer would be. "You call this necessary," I said instead. "You call this survival. But what happens when the next enemy rises? When another species threatens the Union?" Blackwell held my gaze. "Then, we do what must be done." That was the moment I realized the truth. The war had never been about the Zalzir. It had been a lesson, a transformation. Humanity had not just won, they had reshaped the very nature of war itself. The Union could never go back to the way things were. Not after this. Not after we had allowed monsters to fight for us. And worse, we had learned from them. There would be no mercy in the future, no honor, no restraint. The next time war came to the galaxy, we wouldn't hesitate, because we had seen what it took to win, and we could never unlearn it. Blackwell must have seen the realization in my eyes because he spoke again, his voice quieter but no less firm. "The galaxy isn't kind," he said. "It never was. You only survived this long because you hadn't met something worse than you." He turned away, looking at the holographic star charts that once displayed enemy movements, but now showed only empty space where the Zelzir had been. "Now you are the worst thing in the galaxy." A chill ran through me. The war had been lost, until the humans took over, and in doing so, they had changed us all forever.